She stood in the grand parlour of the Ashton estate, wearing a dress that cost more than most families earned in a year, and felt absolutely nothing. The diamond ring on her finger caught the afternoon light, throwing fractured rainbows across the mahogany walls. To anyone watching, Margaret Hartwell looked like a woman who'd won the lottery of life. Beautiful, engaged to one of the wealthiest men in the state, surrounded by luxury and promise. But beauty, as it turned out, was just a convincing mask for emptiness. The engagement had been orchestrated like a business merger because it essentially was one. Her father, struggling with mounting debts and a declining shipping business, had been introduced to Harrison Blake at a winter gala. Harrison was handsome in the way men with unlimited money could afford to be, tailored, groomed, polished to a shine that had nothing to do with character and everything to do with access to the finest things. He'd smiled at her across a crowded room, and her father had seen dollar signs. Within 3 months, they were engaged. Within 6, Margaret found herself living in a mansion that didn't feel like a home, surrounded by servants who called her Miss Hartwell, and a fiancé who seemed more interested in the social status she represented than in who she actually was. But that was before the accident. Before she met a man who'd lost everything society said mattered, and somehow gained something far more valuable in the process. This is the story of how a woman raised to believe that security and status were the same thing as happiness, learned that sometimes the greatest fortune comes wrapped in scars and calluses, offered by someone the world had already written off as broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Margaret discovered she was trapped started like any other. Morning in the Ashton household. Sunlight filtered through curtains so fine they were almost transparent, painting the bedroom in shades of pearl and cream. The room itself was a study in controlled elegance. Everything matched, everything coordinated, everything designed to announce wealth to anyone with eyes to see it. She lay in the 4-poster bed, watching dust motes dance in the light, and felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion over the past months. At 28 years old, Margaret should have been happy. The logic of it was irrefutable. She had security. She had comfort. She had a future planned out in meticulous detail: the wedding in June at the cathedral, the honeymoon in Europe, the eventual move to Harrison's estate upstate, where she would preside over a household staff of 12 and spend her days ensuring the table settings were correct and the gardens were maintained to perfection. Her mother had spent half of yesterday's visit gushing about the wedding plans, about how Margaret was the envy of every woman in their social circle. "You've done so well for yourself," her mother had said, squeezing Margaret's hand with the kind of satisfaction that made it clear this engagement was as much her victory as Margaret's fate. "Harrison is absolutely devoted to you." That was the lie that lived in the center of everything. Harrison wasn't devoted to Margaret, he was devoted to the image she represented. He was devoted to the fact that her family's social connections, even diminished by her father's financial troubles, still carried weight in certain circles. He was devoted to having a beautiful wife who would look appropriate on his arm at dinner parties and charity galas. What he wasn't devoted to was her. Margaret had realized this on their 4th outing together, when she'd made the mistake of expressing an opinion that contradicted his own. They'd been discussing the architectural plans for a new hospital, and she'd suggested that the design prioritized aesthetics over functionality, that the wards should be positioned to maximize natural light and airflow, which was more practical for patient recovery than the symmetrical layout Harrison preferred. He'd smiled at her in that patronizing way that made her want to scream. "That's a charming thought, darling. But you should leave the complexities of design to the professionals. Your job is to look beautiful and support my decisions, not to question them." That had been 6 months ago. She'd stopped offering opinions after that. Now, as she lay in the pristine bedroom of the Ashton estate, Margaret found herself thinking about escape routes. Not in a serious way. She wasn't delusional enough to imagine she could actually leave. Her father's debts were being paid by Harrison's family. Her mother had already ordered her wedding dress. The invitations had been sent to 300 people. But in the dark hours of morning, before the servants began their routines and the house came to life with the sound of someone else's schedule, Margaret allowed herself to imagine it, what it would feel like to walk away from all of this, to choose something real, even if it meant choosing poverty. The fantasy never lasted long. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret sat up, pulling the coverlet to her chin. "Come in." The housemaid, a young woman named Eleanor, entered carrying a breakfast tray. "Good morning, Miss Hartwell. Mr. Blake's downstairs waiting in the drawing room. He said to tell you he's taking you to the Hartwick estate. There's a party this evening." Margaret's stomach twisted. Another party. Another evening of standing beside Harrison while he introduced her to people whose names she'd forget by the time she reached her bed. Another night of smiling while he made decisions about her presence, what she should wear, how long she could stay, who she should speak to, and who beneath their station. "Thank you, Eleanor. I'll be ready in an hour." She dressed carefully in a day dress of pale blue silk, the kind of dress that was meant to make a woman look decorative and harmless. Eleanor pinned her dark hair into an elaborate arrangement that took 40 minutes and required the use of 3 different hairpins and a small tin of pomade. By the time Margaret looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The face was her own, but the expression was someone else's, someone trained to smile without feeling, to nod without thinking, to exist as a beautiful object in someone else's collection. Harrison was waiting in the drawing room, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored that it looked almost weaponized. He stood when she entered, and smiled in that way that looked genuine until you understood it never reached his eyes. "You look absolutely stunning," he said, kissing her cheek in a way that felt more like he was marking territory than expressing affection. Though I did think the emerald dress might have been more appropriate for the occasion. There it was. The small, undermining comment, delivered so smoothly it almost seemed like a suggestion rather than a criticism. Margaret had learned to recognize these moments, the tiny ways he communicated that her choices, her judgment, her very self was slightly inadequate. "I thought the blue was appropriate for an afternoon gathering," she said quietly. Of course. You know I defer to your sense of style." He didn't, and they both knew it. "But perhaps next time we could consult on these decisions together. I only want you to look your absolute best." The drive to the Hartwick estate took 40 minutes through rolling countryside. Margaret watched the landscape pass forests, giving way to open fields, the developed world slowly peeling back to reveal something wilder underneath. She found herself wishing they could drive further, keep going until civilization disappeared entirely, until there was nothing but open space and the possibility of becoming someone else. But the car turned onto a long drive lined with white-painted fencing, and the fantasy dissolved. The Hartwick estate was one of the most impressive properties in the state, a sprawling ranch that had been in the family for 3 generations. The main house was impressive in the way old money made things impressive. Substantial but not ostentatious, beautiful but not trying too hard to prove it. What Margaret hadn't expected to see as they pulled up the circular drive was the chaos. There were men everywhere, moving with urgent purpose. Some were working with horses. Others appeared to be repairing fence sections. One man stood on top of a barn roof, directing the work below with hand signals. The manicured gardens that should have surrounded the house looked neglected, with weeds pushing through between the stones and flower beds that hadn't been planted this season. Harrison frowned. "This is unusual. The Hartwicks should have had this property prepared for guests." A woman emerged from the front door. Margaret recognized her as Catherine Hartwick, the matriarch of the family. She was in her 60s, dressed practically in a day dress that showed signs of actual wear, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She looked harried in a way that Margaret had rarely seen in women of their social class. "Harrison, Margaret, thank you for coming." Catherine's greeting was warm, but distracted. "I apologize for the state of things. We've had some unexpected situations arise." "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked, surprised to find she actually cared about the answer. Catherine hesitated, glancing at Harrison before responding. "My son had an accident. 3 weeks ago, he was overseeing some new fencing on the far pasture, and a horse spooked. He was thrown, and his arm was." She paused, searching for words. It couldn't be saved. The infection set in too, quickly. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. "I'm so sorry. He's alive, which is what matters," Catherine said, though her eyes suggested the situation was more complicated than that simple fact. "He's been difficult about accepting help, about accepting the reality of his situation. We've had to bring in workers because he refuses to let us hire permanent staff. He says he needs to prove he can still manage the ranch." Harrison made a small noise that might have been sympathy or might have been judgment. "That's unfortunate. But I'm sure he'll adjust in time. Resilience is important in these situations." Catherine's expression suggested she disagreed, but she didn't say so. Instead, she led them into the house for lunch. During the meal, Margaret found herself thinking about Catherine's son. She didn't know him. He'd been away when she and Harrison had visited the estate previously, but something about the image Catherine had painted of a man struggling to maintain his identity after losing part of himself resonated with her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. After lunch, while Harrison went to speak with Catherine's husband about some business matter, Margaret excused herself to use the restroom. But instead of heading directly there, she found herself drawn toward the windows that overlooked the working areas. On the far side of the property, near one of the smaller barns, she saw him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a beard that suggested grooming had been the last thing on his mind. He wore a work shirt and practical trousers, and he was using only one arm to manage a section of fencing, somehow rigging the materials in a way that allowed him to work independently. What struck Margaret most, though, was the set of his shoulders, the determined line of his jaw, the absolute refusal in every movement to accept limitation as defeat. She watched him for perhaps 3 minutes, completely absorbed, until a servant appeared beside her, asking if she needed anything. The spell broke, and Margaret quickly moved away from the window. But something had shifted. For the first time in months, she'd glimpsed something real. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The party that evening was precisely what Margaret expected it to be: tedious, performative, and designed primarily to allow wealthy people to congratulate themselves on their own generosity. It was ostensibly a fundraiser for a new children's hospital, which meant wealthy guests paid exorbitant amounts for an evening of mediocre food and the opportunity to announce their donations to anyone who would listen. Margaret stood beside Harrison, wearing the emerald dress. After all, he'd changed his mind during the drive back to the main house, suggesting she'd look absolutely exquisite in it after all, as though he hadn't criticized her initial choice an hour earlier. This was how things worked with Harrison. His preferences were the only constant. Her job was to anticipate and conform to them, even when they contradicted themselves. She'd perfected the art of the social smile, chin slightly lowered, eyes engaged but not challenging, mouth curved upward in a way that suggested genuine pleasure without actual feeling. She deployed it now as Harrison introduced her to a banker and his wife, both of whom seemed primarily interested in discussing the size of their recent donation. "We gave 15,000, the banker's wife announced, as though money itself was an accomplishment. "Of course, with Harrison's position, we assumed you'd be making a similarly substantial contribution." Harrison smiled, already launching into a discussion about the donation. He and Margaret would be making 20,000, though Margaret suspected she'd have no actual say in the matter, despite the implicit "we" in his. Statement. She excused herself to find the ladies' retiring room, a move that required navigating through 3 different parlors and a hallway lined with oil paintings of Hartwick ancestors. The mansion was beautiful but maze-like, built over decades as successive family members added wings and renovations according to their own tastes. It was in one of the hallways leading back to the main party that she heard the voice, "Lost." Margaret turned to find a man leaning against the wall, studying her with an expression somewhere between amusement and concern. He was in his early 30s, with dark hair and a beard that had been trimmed since she'd seen him through the window. He wore evening clothes, a black suit and white shirt, but he wore them with the obvious discomfort of someone accustomed to work clothes and practical wear. His left sleeve was pinned up, folded neatly against his side, an absence that he made no attempt to hide or minimize. This was Catherine's son. Margaret knew it immediately, though they'd never been introduced. "I was trying to find my way back to the main party," Margaret said, suddenly aware that she was alone with a man who wasn't her fiancé, in a hallway far removed from any chaperones. By the standards of their social world, this was already scandalous. "You're going the wrong direction," he said, pushing himself off the wall. "The party's back the other way." Through the blue parlor, then left at the portrait of my great-grandfather, who apparently made his fortune in railroad speculation. "Thank you." Margaret turned, but something made her pause. "I'm Margaret Hartwell. I don't believe we've been introduced. I know who you are. You're engaged to Harrison Blake." He said it without judgment, but without approval either, as though stating a fact. "I'm Thomas Hartwick. I'm sorry about your accident," Margaret said, the words coming from a place of genuine feeling rather than social obligation. "Your mother mentioned it." Thomas's expression hardened slightly. "Did she?" "I'm sure she made it sound more tragic than it actually is. People love a good tragedy. Gives them something to feel sympathetic about while they eat canapés." There was bitterness in his voice, but underneath it, Margaret detected something else, shame. Not the kind of shame that came from social judgment, but the deeper shame of believing oneself diminished. "It's not a tragedy?" Margaret asked carefully. Thomas studied her for a moment, as if trying to determine whether she was being genuine or polite. "No," he said finally, "it's an inconvenience. And an education in discovering who actually values you and who was just interested in the version of you that fit their expectations." The words hit Margaret with the force of recognition. She understood exactly what he meant. She lived it every day, the performance of being what was expected, the careful deletion of any parts of herself that might complicate the image. "Come on," Thomas said, gesturing down the hallway. "I'll show you back. Fair warning, though, if Harrison asks, you should probably tell him we didn't actually speak. People like him tend to get territorial about their fiancés. I learned that when he visited the ranch last month and made several unpleasant comments about the tragedy of my situation, as though my life ending was somehow offensive to him personally." They walked back through the hallways together, moving through the formal spaces of the mansion. Thomas kept up a running commentary about the house's architecture, pointing out additions and renovations, talking about the family history with a kind of weary affection that suggested he loved this place, even as he was frustrated by what it represented. When they reached the edge of the main party, Thomas paused. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you look like someone pretending to be happy. If you ever get tired of the performance, there's a ranch about 20 miles north of here. We always need extra hands, and I don't much care about social status or family connections or whether someone fits the right mold. I just care whether they can work and whether they're honest about who they are." Before Margaret could respond, he was gone, melting back into the crowd. She stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. The invitation hadn't been phrased as an invitation at all. It was too oblique for that, too deniable. But it had been one nonetheless. A way out, if she wanted it. A place where she could exist as something other than an accessory. Harrison found her a few minutes later, looking vaguely irritated. "Where have you been? You've been gone nearly 20 minutes. People have been asking about you, and I've had to make excuses. I was lost, Margaret said, deploying the social smile again. The house is quite complicated. Yes, well, Hartwicks have never been known for practical design choices. Come, we should circulate more. I want to ensure we're seen speaking with the Ashtons. Their daughter is married to a congressman now, and it would be beneficial for our image. Margaret followed him back into the party, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over what Thomas had said. She looked at him once from across the room. He was standing with his mother, and Catherine was saying something to him that made him smile. A real smile, not the practiced expression that everyone wore at events like this. He caught her looking and held her gaze for just a moment, long enough to convey understanding, long enough to suggest that the alternative he'd offered was still available. The drive back to her father's house, where she was still living until the wedding took place in near silence. Harrison seemed preoccupied, discussing some business matter with himself more than with her. Margaret stared out the window at the dark landscape, thinking about ranches and honest work and the radical notion of being valued for who we actually were, rather than what you could provide. When the car pulled up to her father's house, Harrison walked her to the door as he always did, kissed her cheek in his territorial way, and promised to call on her the following week. Margaret watched the car disappear into the darkness, then stood in the foyer of her father's house, listening to the clock in the hallway tick away the seconds of her carefully planned future. She thought about Thomas's words about the performance, about the tragedy of people valuing only the versions of you that fit their needs. She thought about his one-armed confidence as he worked on that fence, refusing to apologize for his limitations or accept pity as compensation. For the first time since becoming engaged to Harrison Blake, Margaret allowed herself to consider seriously what it would mean to say no, to walk away from security and status and the life everyone expected her to want. Not tonight. Not yet. But the idea had taken root, and like seeds that land in good soil, it had begun to grow. 2 weeks passed, in a state of heightened awareness that Margaret had never experienced before. The world suddenly felt divided into 2 categories: the life she was supposed to want and the life that might exist elsewhere. She attended dinners with Harrison's family, where his mother discussed wedding plans with alarming specificity, the number of courses at the reception, the flowers that would be arranged in the cathedral, the honeymoon itinerary that Harrison had already booked without consulting her. She smiled and nodded and offered suggestions that were either dismissed or incorporated as though they'd been Harrison's ideas all along. She spent her days at her father's house in a state of pleasant numbness, wearing clothes appropriate to her station, reading books that were deemed suitable for young women of her class, participating in the careful social rituals that filled the days of unmarried women waiting to become wives. And underneath it all, she thought about the Hartwick ranch. She'd learned where it was, had driven past it once in a carriage with a friend, had somehow managed to gather information about its operation and reputation without arousing suspicion. It was a legitimate enterprise: cattle, horses, land management successful enough to be self-sustaining, operated with a reputation for fair dealing and honest work. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear into useful labor and emerge as something other than an ornament. The opportunity to visit came through her mother, which felt almost cosmically ironic. Catherine Hartwick had apparently decided that Margaret needed to be more involved in the wedding planning, a gesture that Harrison's mother seemed to interpret as a chance to bond with the future bride. She'd invited Margaret to visit the Hartwick estate for a full day, ostensibly to discuss floral arrangements, though Margaret suspected the real purpose was to soften what had apparently been some family tension. Harrison had been dismissive of the invitation. "You don't need to spend time with them before the wedding," he'd said. "It's unnecessary. Besides, you'll be seeing them frequently enough once we're married." But Margaret's father had overruled him, suggesting that it would be rude to refuse Catherine's kindness. There was a particular firmness in her father's voice that suggested he was using his daughter's presence at the estate as a way to maintain the Hartwick family's interest in continuing the financial arrangement that was keeping him solvent. So Margaret found herself in a carriage on a Thursday morning, driving toward the ranch, her heart beating so hard she was certain the driver could hear it. Catherine greeted her warmly, but with an energy that suggested she had multiple agendas. They spent the morning in the house, discussing flowers and fabric samples, Catherine's attention divided between the wedding details and something that seemed to preoccupy her more deeply. "Margaret," Catherine said finally, setting down a swatch of cream-colored silk, "I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you're intelligent enough to recognize honesty when you hear it. This wedding concerns me." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I'm not sure I understand." "Harrison Blake is a good match on paper," Catherine continued carefully. "He's wealthy, established, from an excellent family. By every metric of social success, he's exactly what a woman in your position should want. But I've watched him with you, and what I see is a man who wants a wife the way he wants a painting, something beautiful to display, something that reflects well on his taste and status." Margaret didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her this directly about her engagement. "I could be wrong," Catherine said, "but I don't think so. And I'm telling you this because I've recently had my eyes open to what it means when someone values you not for the performance you give, but for who you actually are underneath." Before Margaret could respond, Catherine stood. "Come with me. I want to show you something." They walked out of the house, past the formal gardens, toward the working sections of the property. As they approached one of the smaller barns, Margaret could see activity: someone working with a horse, moving with careful, practiced efficiency. Thomas. He was working with a young stallion, using techniques Margaret didn't understand, but that seemed to involve patience and communication rather than force. He moved around the animal, using his body and his one arm with such natural coordination that it took Margaret a moment to remember he was operating with a significant limitation. Catherine watched him work for a moment, then turned to Margaret. "3 weeks ago, Thomas was someone I wasn't sure would survive his injury with his spirit intact. He was depressed, angry, convinced that his life was over because he couldn't work the way he had before. And then something changed. He started adapting, finding new methods, refusing to accept that limitation meant elimination." Catherine gestured toward the barn. "What strikes me most is that he's doing this work because he chooses to, not because someone expects him to. He works because the work matters to him, not because it enhances his social standing or proves something to other people." "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Because I think you might recognize something in him that you need to understand about yourself," Catherine said. "But more importantly, because I believe in giving people information and then letting them make their own decisions. What you do with this knowledge is entirely up to you." As if on cue, Thomas looked up from his work and saw them. He didn't wave or approach. He simply acknowledged their presence with a nod, then returned his attention to the horse. Catherine led Margaret back to the house, and they spent the rest of the day discussing wedding details. But Margaret's mind was elsewhere, turning over Catherine's words, replaying the image of Thomas working with such focused purpose. Before Margaret left to return to her father's house, Catherine pulled her aside. "There's a summer festival in the town near here next Saturday," she said. "The local ranchers and farmers gather to sell goods and livestock. Thomas will be there selling some of his horses. If you happen to be in the area, it would be quite a public place. Nothing inappropriate about two acquaintances encountering each other at a community event." Margaret understood what Catherine was offering: permission, in a way, plausible deniability. A chance to see Thomas again in a context that wouldn't raise eyebrows or create scandal. The drive back to her father's house felt both longer and shorter than usual. Margaret's mind was racing, calculating, considering implications and consequences. She could ignore Catherine's suggestion. She could marry Harrison as planned, live the life that had been arranged for her, accept security in exchange for authenticity. Many women did exactly that. Many women survived it. But Thomas's words kept echoing in her mind, people valuing only the versions of you that fit their needs. That night, Margaret sat in her bedroom and wrote a letter to Harrison, informing him that she needed to attend a community event the following Saturday for reasons related to understanding rural life and agricultural concerns, a framing that was technically true and aligned with his belief that she was somewhat naive about practical matters. She sent the letter before she could talk herself out of it. His response came the next morning, delivered by courier. He had no objection to her attending the festival, though he expressed mild amusement at her sudden interest in farming. He would not be joining her, he had business in the city. But he approved of the outing. Margaret held the letter in her hands, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. She was going to see Thomas again, not by accident, not casually, with intention and purpose and full awareness that this was a deviation from her prescribed path. She was terrified. She was also, for the first time in months, genuinely alive. The week crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret found herself distracted during social engagements, unable to focus on conversations about weddings and household management. She caught her mother watching her with concern several times, clearly wondering what had shifted in her daughter's demeanor. By Saturday morning, Margaret's heart was racing so intensely that she had to sit down several times while dressing. She wore a day dress that was practical but still fashionable, appropriate for a community event, but not so formal that she'd seem absurd among people actually engaged in work. Her father's driver took her to the festival, dropping her at the edge of town with instructions to return in 3 hours. Margaret stepped out of the carriage and into a world she'd never inhabited before. The festival was nothing like the social events she normally attended. There were no servants circulating with champagne. There was dust from the unpaved ground, the smell of horses and livestock, the sound of people engaged in actual negotiation and commerce rather than performative social exchange. And there, in a section of the fairgrounds where horses were being displayed, was Thomas. He was talking with a potential buyer, explaining something about one of the horses with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that Margaret had rarely witnessed in men of her social class. When he finished with the buyer and looked up, he saw her. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he smiled, a real smile, not the practiced expression she was accustomed to, and walked toward her. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, and Margaret understood that this was a lie. He'd known. Catherine must have told him. "I was interested in learning more about ranching," Margaret said carefully. "Your mother mentioned the festival." "Did she?" Thomas's expression suggested he knew exactly what his mother had done and approved entirely. "Well, as it happens, I know quite a bit about ranching. If you wanted a tour, I'd be happy to show you around." Margaret looked back at the carriage, already disappearing down the road. She looked at Thomas, at the honest interest in his eyes, at the way he stood confident, comfortable in his own skin, not performing for anyone. She thought about Harrison, about the careful life that had been planned for her, about the years stretching ahead of dining room conversations and social obligations, and the slow erasure of everything authentic about herself. "I'd like that very much," she said. Thomas led Margaret through the festival grounds with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. He introduced her to other ranchers, explained the differences between bloodlines and breeding practices, showed her horses that he'd trained himself, all with a one-armed efficiency that made his injury seem almost irrelevant to his competence. What struck Margaret most was how differently people treated him here compared to how they treated him at formal social events. At the Hartwick party, there had been an undercurrent of pity, a sense that people were performing sympathy for his circumstance. Here, they treated him as an equal, asked his opinions on livestock and land management, engaged with him as a professional rather than a tragedy. "This is your world," Margaret observed as they stood watching a group of horses being auctioned. "Part of it," Thomas corrected. "The work is my world. The people, the community, the actual purpose behind what I'm doing, that's all part of it. It's different from yours, isn't it? Where the point seems to be the appearance of..." doing something rather than actually doing it. It was not a kind observation, but it was honest. Margaret found herself appreciating the honesty more than she would have appreciated flattery. Completely different, she admitted. Where I come from, the goal is to look like you're managing things while actually managing nothing. Real work is considered beneath our station. That sounds suffocating, Thomas said. It is, Margaret replied. They walked for another hour, and Thomas showed her the ranch operation, not just the show animals for the festival, but the actual working ranch he was building. He explained his plans for breeding programs, rotational grazing, sustainable land management. He talked about it with the kind of passion that Margaret had never heard in Harrison's voice, not even when discussing his own business interests. When they finally sat down on a bench overlooking the fairground, Margaret realized several hours had passed. "I should be honest with you," Thomas said suddenly, "about why my mother invited you here. She's worried about your engagement. She thinks you're making a mistake." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Did she tell you that specifically?" "Not in so many words, but she didn't need to. I can see it." Thomas turned to look at her directly. "You're performing all the time. Even now, talking to me. There's a part of you that's measuring every word, making sure you're saying the right thing. That's not how people are supposed to live. It's how women like me are trained to live," Margaret said quietly. "I know. And it's tragic, and I understand the security is appealing, and I'm not going to pretend that rejecting that life wouldn't come with real costs. But Margaret, I watched what my mother has become after 40 years of that kind of life. She's a shell. She exists beautifully, but she doesn't actually live. And I think if you marry Harrison, that's what will happen to you." Margaret wanted to argue with him, but she couldn't, because he was right. She could see the trajectory, clearly decades of wearing the right clothes, saying the right things, managing a household that didn't need managing, raising children who would be handed every advantage except the most important one, the knowledge that they could choose their own lives. "What are you suggesting?" she asked carefully. "That I break my engagement?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Thomas said. "I'm stating a fact. That would be one option available to you. What you do with that option is your decision." The carriage arrived to collect Margaret before she could respond. Thomas walked her back to where it was waiting, and as she climbed inside, he pressed a piece of paper into her hand. "My address," he said, "if you ever need it. No pressure, no expectations, just an alternative." The drive back to her father's house felt surreal. Margaret stared out the window at the landscape passing, her hand clenched around the paper Thomas had given her. She didn't open it, didn't look at what he'd written, just held it like evidence of a choice she hadn't made yet but might. When she arrived home, she found her mother waiting in the parlor. Margaret's heart sank. Her mother only appeared at her father's house when something significant had happened. "Harrison came by this morning," her mother said without preamble. "He was quite upset, Margaret. He'd heard from someone at the Hartwick estate that you'd been seen at the festival, speaking with Thomas Hartwick for an extended period of time." Margaret's mouth went dry. "I was simply learning about—" "I don't care what you were doing," her mother interrupted. "What concerns me is the perception. Do you understand how this looks? An engaged woman spending hours alone with an unmarried man, a man who, while unfortunate in his circumstances, is still a man. It's scandalous, Margaret. Absolutely scandalous. Mother, nothing inappropriate happened. It doesn't matter what happened. It matters what people think happened." Her mother's voice was sharp with frustration. "I've spent years managing your reputation, ensuring you made an advantageous match. And now, mere weeks before your wedding, you're engaging in the sort of behavior that could destroy everything we've built." "Maybe I don't want everything you've built," Margaret said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Her mother stared at her as though she'd spoken a foreign language. "What are you saying?" her mother asked slowly. "I'm saying that I'm not sure I want to marry Harrison. The words were out before Margaret had consciously decided to say them, but once they were in the air, they felt true in a way nothing else had in months. Her mother stood abruptly, her face flushing with anger. "You are going to marry Harrison Blake, and you're going to be grateful for the opportunity. Do you have any idea how fortunate you are? Do you understand what your father has sacrificed to make this match possible?" "I understand that father's debts are being paid by Harrison's family," Margaret said flatly. "I understand that this engagement is essentially a business transaction, and I'm the commodity being exchanged." "Of course, it's a transaction," her mother snapped. "That's what marriage is. That's what life is, Margaret. It's not a romance novel. It's not about feelings or passion or whatever foolish notions you've developed. It's about security, status, and ensuring that you have a respectable life. Harrison provides all of that, at the cost of my actual self," Margaret replied. Her mother's expression hardened. "Your actual self is irrelevant. What matters is your duty to your family. Your father's reputation depends on this match. Our financial security depends on this match. Thousands of people are depending on this wedding to happen. You cannot simply decide to destroy everyone's future because you've developed some romantic fantasy about a crippled rancher." The word landed like a physical blow. Crippled, as though Thomas's worth had been quantified and found lacking because of a missing limb. "He's not crippled," Margaret said coldly. "He's more capable than most men I know, and he treats me like I matter, like my thoughts and opinions have value. Unlike Harrison, who treats me like an object he's purchased." "Thomas Hartwick is working class," her mother said, as though this explained everything. "He has no prospects, no standing, no future. He's a rancher, Margaret. You'd be throwing away everything for a life of manual labor and social obscurity." "Perhaps that's exactly what I want," Margaret said. Her mother's face went pale. "If you break this engagement, I will never forgive you. Your father will never forgive you. You will be destroyed socially. No respectable man will ever want you. You'll be marked as the woman who jilted Harrison Blake. And you'll deserve every bit of ostracism that comes your way." Margaret felt the weight of the threat settle over her like a shroud. She understood in that moment the full cost of the choice she was considering. It wasn't just about walking away from security. It was about accepting exile from everyone and everything she'd known her entire life. Her mother left an hour later, her disappointment radiating off her like heat from a fire. Margaret sat alone in her father's house, holding the paper with Thomas's address, and allowed herself to cry. Not tears of regret, but tears of grief. Grief for the life she wouldn't be able to have if she chose honesty. Grief for the family relationships that would fracture under the weight of her independence. Grief for the social standing that would be stripped away if she rejected the acceptable path. But underneath the grief was something else. A small, persistent voice suggesting that perhaps the alternative was worth the cost. That night, Margaret sat at her desk and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Harrison, informing him that she could not, in good conscience, proceed with their engagement. She tried to be kind about it, though she suspected kindness would be received as rejection. She referenced irreconcilable differences and her own realization that she was not the woman he deserved. She did not mention Thomas. The second letter was to her father, explaining her decision and accepting full responsibility for any financial consequences. She suggested that the Hartwick family might be amenable to some form of arrangement that didn't require her marriage to complete their obligation, a suggestion that was almost certainly naive, but which represented her attempt to minimize the damage her choice would cause. She sealed both letters and set them on the desk. Then she picked up the paper with Thomas's address and finally opened it. Beneath the address, he'd written a single sentence: "In case you want to choose something real." Margaret held that address in her hand for a long time, understanding that this was the moment where she could turn back, where she could unsend the letters in her mind, return to the safety of the predetermined path, accept the life that was waiting for her. Or she could step into the unknown. At midnight, she sealed the letters in an envelope and arranged for them to be delivered in the morning. Then she went to bed, knowing that by tomorrow, nothing in her life would ever be the same. The letters were delivered on a Sunday morning, which Margaret would later reflect was fitting timing her decision to arrive when everyone was gathered for church, when the news would have maximum dispersal potential among the social circles that mattered most. She didn't witness the immediate aftermath directly. Instead, she heard about it through a parade of visitors who arrived at her father's house throughout the day, each one bringing new versions of the scandal, each one more dramatized than the last. Harrison had apparently received her letter with quiet dignity, then spent the afternoon visiting everyone of importance in their social circle, explaining the situation in a way that positioned Margaret as emotionally unstable and ungrateful. He'd mentioned to several people that she'd been spending time with Thomas Hartwick, allowing listeners to draw their own conclusions about the reasons behind her rejection. By evening, the narrative had solidified. Margaret Hartwell had jilted one of the most eligible men in the state because she'd developed an inappropriate attachment to a working-class rancher. She was unstable, unreliable, and utterly unfit for respectable society. Her mother arrived at her father's house in the late afternoon, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she asked, not bothering with greetings. "The humiliation? The scandal? People are calling our house asking if it's true, if you've actually gone mad. I've broken an engagement that shouldn't have happened in the first place," Margaret said quietly. "You've destroyed your future," her mother corrected. "I've spent all day fielding inquiries from women who seemed disappointed that the gossip about you was true. Apparently, watching a young woman of good family reject security for a romanticized fantasy about a crippled rancher is entertainment to these people." "He's not," Margaret started, but her mother cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I don't want to hear it. Your father is devastated. Do you understand what this means for him? The Hartwicks will likely withdraw their financial support now that the engagement is broken. Your father's business is already fragile. This betrayal may well bankrupt him." Margaret felt the words like physical blows, each one landing with the weight of guilt and consequence. She hadn't wanted to hurt her father. She'd tried to protect him by taking responsibility in her letter. But clearly, words on paper meant nothing compared to the reality of lost investment. "What do you want me to do?" Margaret asked. "I want you to send another letter to Harrison, apologizing, citing temporary emotional disturbance, and requesting that the engagement be renewed." Her mother said flatly, "You will marry him in June as planned. You will put on a smile and pretend this never happened. And you will ensure that our family's reputation is restored." "I can't do that," Margaret said. "Then you have destroyed this family for nothing," her mother replied. "You're no longer welcome here. Pack whatever you can carry. You'll need to find somewhere else to live." The eviction came with shocking swiftness. Within hours, Margaret found herself with a single trunk of belongings and nowhere to go. Her father wouldn't see her. Her mother had made clear that returning to the family home was no longer an option. The few friends she had in social circles had already begun distancing themselves, positioning themselves on the side of propriety and away from scandal. By evening, Margaret was sitting in a hotel room, paid for with money she'd withdrawn from her modest personal account, staring at the address Thomas had given her. She could stay in the hotel for perhaps 2 weeks. After that, her money would run out. She would have no home, no family, no social standing. In their world, she would effectively cease to exist invisible, not because she'd chosen it, but because she'd been cast out. The alternative was to swallow her pride, contact Harrison, beg forgiveness, accept the life that had been planned for her. It would be accepted. Society would forgive her because forgiveness was easier than sustained judgment. Within a few months, the scandal would fade. In a year, it would be forgotten. Margaret pulled out paper and wrote a letter to Thomas explaining everything. She tried to be matter-of-fact about it, but she could feel the desperation creeping into her words. She wasn't asking for anything specific. She didn't want charity, didn't want to burden him with her mistakes. But she was writing because she had nowhere else to turn. She sealed the letter and arranged for it to be delivered the next morning. The waiting was agonizing. Margaret spent the day in her hotel room, alternating between reading books and staring at the walls, her mind cycling through scenarios. What if Thomas didn't want to see her? What if Catherine's invitation had been sympathy rather than genuine interest? What if she was about to throw away everything, only to find herself alone and destitute? The knock on her door came in late afternoon. Thomas stood in the hallway, dusty from travel, his expression unreadable. He held her letter in his hand. "You could have just asked," he said by way of greeting. "You didn't need to write a formal letter explaining your entire situation like you were applying for employment." Margaret didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me, after everything I've put you in the middle of." "You haven't put me in the middle of anything," Thomas said. "You made a decision about your own life. That's not something you need to apologize for." He looked around the hotel room, taking in the sparse furnishings and Margaret's single trunk. "Is this where you're planning to stay?" "Until my money runs out," Margaret said. "After that, I'm not sure." Thomas set down her letter and pulled out a chair, sitting down with the casual confidence that was becoming familiar to her. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack your things. I'm going to drive you to the ranch. My mother has already prepared a room for you. You'll work. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering employment. There's plenty of work on a functioning ranch, and I need someone I can trust to help manage the administrative side of things. The pay won't be generous, but it will be honest work for honest wages." "Your mother prepared a room?" Margaret asked, startled. "She received your letter before I did," Thomas said. "She apparently has some experience with breaking engagements and family exile. She spent an hour explaining to me that I needed to fetch you immediately before you did something dramatic like disappear into a life of desperate poverty." "Despite everything," Margaret smiled, "your mother is remarkable." "She is," Thomas agreed, "which is why you're not going to disappoint her by refusing her hospitality." He stood, moving toward her trunk. "Come on, let's get you packed properly. And Margaret, you're not running away or accepting charity. You're making a choice. Own it." The drive to the Hartwick Ranch felt like crossing a threshold into a different world. As they left the city behind and moved into open countryside, Margaret felt something shift inside her, a release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Thomas talked about the ranch as they drove, explaining his plans, describing the work that needed to be done. He didn't ask about her past, didn't express sympathy for her situation, didn't treat her as a tragic figure who'd made poor choices. He simply spoke to her as though she were capable and interesting and worth listening to. When they arrived at the ranch, Catherine was waiting on the porch. She embraced Margaret with genuine warmth, then stepped back to study her face. "You look like someone who just stepped off a cliff," Catherine observed. "I feel like someone who just stepped off a cliff," Margaret admitted. "Good," Catherine said. "That's what choosing your own life feels like at first. It gets better." She led Margaret inside. "Come on. Let me show you to your room. Tomorrow you can start learning the ranch operation, but tonight you're going to eat a real meal and sleep in a real bed, and we're going to pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist." The bedroom was simple but comfortable, practical furniture, clean linens, a window that overlooked the working ranch. It was nothing like the elaborate guest room at the Ashton estate, yet somehow it felt more welcoming. That evening, Margaret sat at dinner with Thomas and Catherine, eating food that had been prepared without concern for social convention or aesthetic presentation, simply because it tasted good and nourished the body. They discussed ranch operations, breeding programs, the challenges of managing land in a region prone to drought. No one asked Margaret about her broken engagement. No one expressed sympathy for her fallen status. Thomas and Catherine simply treated her as a person who had made a decision and was now living with the consequences of that decision, which Margaret realized was a form of respect that was far more valuable than pity. Later that night, as Margaret lay in her simple bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, she thought about the life she'd rejected. The beautiful clothes that she'd never again be able to wear in proper society, the social connections that had been severed, the family relationships that might never be repaired. The cost was real, the losses were substantial, but for the first time since her engagement, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months: peace. Not happiness, exactly. The situation was still uncertain, still fraught with potential for additional hardship. But peace came from knowing that she'd chosen authenticity over safety, that she was living her own life rather than performing someone else's expectations. Outside her window, the stars were impossibly bright, untethered to the concerns of society and status and the careful maintenance of social standing. Margaret watched them until sleep finally claimed her, and when she dreamed of open land and honest work and the possibility of becoming someone real. Margaret woke before dawn on her first full day at the ranch, disoriented by the unfamiliar sounds, the calls of birds she couldn't identify, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the house settling in the cool morning air. For a moment, she lay in the darkness, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Then she remembered that she had a choice now. She could get up and begin learning this new world, or she could stay in bed and contemplate what she'd lost. The fact that the choice existed at all felt revolutionary. She dressed in the plain day dress she'd worn to the festival, the only practical garment she owned, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was already occupied by Catherine, who was preparing breakfast with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this task thousands of times. "You're up early?" Catherine observed, not looking away from the eggs she was cracking into a cast-iron skillet. "I wasn't sure what time to wake," Margaret admitted. "On a ranch, you wake when there's work to be done," Catherine said. "Thomas will be in shortly. We eat first, then the real day begins." She glanced at Margaret. "Fair warning, the work is harder than anything you've done before. Your hands will develop blisters, your back will ache, you'll be dirty in ways that would horrify your mother. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret thought about her mother's words, about the performance of her previous life, about standing still while someone else made all the meaningful decisions. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." Thomas arrived as Catherine was setting the food on the table. He was already dusty from morning chores, his single arm somehow accommodating multiple tasks with practiced ease. He greeted Margaret with a nod and began eating with the unself-conscious appetite of someone who'd burned calories through physical labor. "The south pasture fence needs mending," he said to Catherine between bites, "and I want to move the breeding stock to the northern grazing area before the heat gets too intense. Margaret, you ready to work?" Margaret nodded, uncertain exactly what she'd agreed to. What followed was an education conducted entirely through doing rather than explaining. Thomas took her to the barn and showed her how to properly care for horses, how to brush them, how to check their hooves, how to recognize the subtle signs of health or illness. He demonstrated the work with his one arm, moving with such efficiency that Margaret found herself watching intently, understanding that her assumptions about what a one-armed man could accomplish had been profoundly wrong. "The key," Thomas said, showing her how to position herself relative to the horse, "is understanding that limitation just means you have to be smarter about how you approach a problem. You can't muscle through everything. So you learn to use leverage, timing, psychology. Half of working with animals is understanding what they need and how to communicate that you understand it." They moved through the day with methodical purpose. Margaret learned to fix fence sections, discovering that it required less raw strength than she'd imagined and more precision and understanding of structural principles. She learned to read a horse's temperament from the position of its ears and the set of its body. She learned that ranch work was a conversation between human and animal, between intention and reality, between what you wanted to accomplish and what the land would allow. By midday, Margaret's hands had developed blisters, and her lower back ached with a dull, persistent pain. But she also felt something else, a sense of purpose, of accomplishment, of time spent doing something that mattered, rather than something that merely looked like it mattered. They stopped for lunch under a large oak tree that provided shade across a section of the property. Catherine had packed food, bread, cheese, cured meat, fresh fruit. Nothing fancy, everything practical. As they ate, Thomas pointed out the boundaries of the property, explaining his plans for expansion, the challenges the ranch faced, the vision he was working toward. "Before the accident," he said, "I was planning to do this the conventional way, hire a large staff, manage from a distance, let other people do most of the actual work. It seemed more respectable somehow, like that's what successful ranchers did." He gestured at the property with his remaining arm. "Then I lost the arm, and I realized I couldn't maintain that kind of operation. I had to actually do the work myself." "Was that difficult?" Margaret asked. "At first, yes, but then I realized it was the best thing that could have happened to me." Thomas looked at her directly. "When you're forced to understand the actual work, when you can't hide behind management structures and hired hands, you start to see what actually matters. And what matters is this: the land, the animals, the honest exchange of labor for survival. Everything else is just noise." Margaret understood what he was saying, but more importantly, she understood what he wasn't saying, that her rejection of Harrison and security had fundamentally changed her. Understanding of what mattered, she couldn't go back to performing a life. Once you understood that the performance was hollow, you couldn't make yourself believe in it anymore. The afternoon brought new challenges. Thomas took her to work with the younger horses, teaching her how to move them through a training progression. This required patience, observation, and the ability to read subtle communication from an animal that was both more powerful and more vulnerable than she was. One of the horses, a young mare named Scout, was particularly resistant to the halter training. She'd pull away. Buck refused to cooperate. Margaret found herself frustrated, ready to force compliance through sheer willpower. "That won't work," Thomas said quietly, watching her struggle. "She's not being difficult. She's being afraid. You're trying to overcome her fear through force, which just confirms that she should be afraid. Instead, you need to show her that cooperating is safer than resisting." He showed her how to position herself differently, how to move in a way that didn't trigger the horse's flight response, how to reward compliance immediately and generously. It took nearly an hour, but eventually Scout accepted the halter without resistance, and Margaret felt a disproportionate sense of accomplishment. "This is what real work is," Thomas said as they finished up for the day. "It's not about dominating, it's about understanding and communication. It's about seeing what something needs and providing it, not what you want it to need." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret found herself thinking about the parallels between training a horse and the work of rebuilding a life. You couldn't force yourself into a new identity. You had to let the old one fall away gradually, through small moments of understanding, through choosing differently again and again, until the new way became natural. That evening, Catherine taught Margaret how to prepare a proper meal on the ranch. Nothing like the elaborate dishes prepared by her family's cook, but simple food prepared with knowledge of flavor and nutrition. They made a stew from beef and vegetables, bread that required kneading and patience, an apple pie from fruit stored in the cellar. While they worked, Catherine talked about her own journey, how she'd married into the Hartwick family as a young woman, how she'd struggled with the performance of being a wealthy rancher's wife, how she'd eventually come to understand that the only life worth living was one built on honest work and genuine connection. "People think rejecting security means choosing poverty," Catherine said, her hands working the pie dough with expert efficiency. "But that's not quite right. It means choosing authenticity over the illusion of safety. And authenticity, when built on a foundation of real work and real skills, creates a different kind of security. It's not dependent on anyone else's approval. It exists because you've earned it. Margaret listened, understanding that Catherine was speaking from hard-won experience, not theoretical knowledge. This woman had rejected the comfortable life available to her and chosen something harder but more real. Later that night, Margaret sat in her room and wrote a letter to her father. She didn't apologize for breaking the engagement that would be dishonest, but she explained what she was doing, where she was, and that she was working to support herself rather than being a burden to anyone. She acknowledged that their relationship had been damaged, but left the door open for future reconciliation if he chose it. She didn't know if he would respond. Society might have poisoned him against her entirely. But she'd learned today that some things were worth the risk of rejection. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Margaret woke before dawn, worked through the morning on ranch tasks, stopped for midday meals, continued working into the afternoon. By evening, she was so physically exhausted that sleep came easily. Her hands developed calluses, her skin darkened from sun exposure, her muscles became stronger. She stopped wearing the elaborate day dresses and began wearing practical work clothes that she'd fashioned from simpler fabrics. She learned to move through the ranch with purpose and efficiency. But more importantly, she learned to think differently. The constant performance of her previous life had been exhausting in a way she'd never fully acknowledged. Here, there was no need to pretend. If she was tired, she said so. If she had an idea, she voiced it. If she made a mistake, she acknowledged it and did better next time. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into her time at the ranch, Thomas asked for her input on a problem he was trying to solve. He'd been struggling with the layout of the new section of barn he wanted to construct, and he showed her his sketches. Margaret studied them, thinking about the work she'd done, about the flow of animals and materials through the existing structures. She made a suggestion, a modification to the entry that would make the movement of horses more efficient. Thomas listened, considered, then nodded slowly. "That's better than my original plan," he said. "Can you draw it out? I want to see if I can modify the whole structure based on this idea." For the first time in her life, Margaret realized someone was asking for her input, not because it was socially appropriate, but because it was actually valuable. She spent the next 2 hours with Thomas, developing the design, working through practical considerations, solving problems together. By the time they finished, Margaret had contributed something tangible to the ranch, something that would make the operation more efficient, something that would be useful every single day. She walked back to the house that evening, feeling lighter than she had since arriving. Not because her life was easy, not because her family situation had improved, but because she was building something real, something that mattered, something that couldn't be taken away by social judgment or family disapproval. Thomas caught up with her at the gate to the house. "You're good at this," he said simply. "The work, the thinking, the problem-solving. You're actually good at it." "Thank you," Margaret said, understanding that this was perhaps the highest compliment she could receive from him, acknowledgement of capability, not performance. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something," Thomas continued. "You didn't come here as charity. You came here as someone who needed an alternative, yes, but you've proven yourself to be valuable. You're earning your place here, not because of who your family was, but because of what you can do." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of something cleaner than sadness. They were tears of recognition, of finally being seen for what she actually was, rather than what she was supposed to be. That night, she slept more deeply and peacefully than she had in years, and dreamed of barns being built and horses running free across open land. 6 weeks into her time at the ranch, Margaret received a visitor she wasn't expecting. She was working in the barn, repairing a section of fencing alongside Thomas, when one of the ranch hands appeared with news that someone was at the house asking for her. Margaret's first instinct was dread. She'd been living in a kind of bubble, where the outside world and its judgments seemed distant and irrelevant. The arrival of someone from that world felt like an intrusion. It was her father. He stood in the parlour, still wearing his travelling clothes, looking smaller and more worn than Margaret remembered. His face carried new lines, and his eyes had lost some of the authoritative confidence they'd once held. Catherine had apparently offered him refreshment, but he declined. "Father," Margaret said, uncertain whether to embrace him or maintain distance. "Margaret." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her appearance, the calloused hands, the sun-darkened skin, the practical work dress. "You look different." "I am different," Margaret said simply. "How did you find me?" "Your mother eventually provided the location, though she did so with great reluctance." He moved to sit in one of the chairs, gesturing for her to do the same. "I came because I needed to see for myself whether you'd actually lost your mind or whether there was something else happening here." Margaret sat, waiting. She'd prepared herself for this conversation many times over the past weeks, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure what to say. "Your rejection of Harrison has caused considerable difficulty," her father began. "The financial arrangement with the Hartwick family has been complicated. They've been understanding about the broken engagement, but the situation has put strain on several business relationships." "I'm sorry for that," Margaret said, "truly. But I couldn't continue with a life that was built on a lie." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Your mother says you've developed an inappropriate attachment to Thomas Hartwick, that you've thrown away a respectable future for this." He gestured vaguely at the room around them, the practical furnishings, the evidence of a working household rather than a decorative one. "My attachment to Thomas isn't inappropriate," Margaret said carefully. "But more importantly, I've discovered that what I wanted out of life was never what I thought I wanted. I was trained to believe that security and status were the same as happiness. I've learned they're not." Her father rubbed his temples. "Margaret, I'm a practical man. I've built a business through understanding how the world actually works, not how I wish it would work. And the reality is that you've made choices that have severe social consequences. You're no longer welcome in the circles we move in. You're considered unstable, unreliable, potentially morally questionable for your time here with an unmarried man." "I'm aware of that," Margaret said. "Are you?" Her father leaned forward. "Do you understand what that means? That you cannot return to your previous life, even if you wanted to? That you've essentially exiled yourself from everything you were born into?" "Yes," Margaret said, "I understand it. And I've accepted it." There was a long silence. Margaret could see her father wrestling with something, some internal conflict between his expectations and whatever he was observing in his daughter. "I came here prepared to convince you to return," he said finally. "To explain that Harrison has agreed to take you back, that if you would simply apologize and resume the engagement, everything could be restored. Your mother and I have been preparing a narrative that explains your behavior as temporary emotional disturbance. We could make it work." Margaret felt a familiar pressure in her chest, the pull of her old life, the seductive promise of restored security and family approval. For a moment, she allowed herself to consider it. How easy it would be to simply return, to accept the comfortable prison of her previous existence. But then she thought about the work she'd done, the skills she'd developed, the moments of genuine accomplishment when she'd contributed something real rather than something performative. "I can't do that, Father," she said quietly. "I can't go back. I won't pretend to be someone I'm not anymore." Her father stood abruptly, walking to the window to look out at the ranch. "Do you love him? Thomas Hartwick?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She considered lying, considered giving him the answer he might want to hear. But she'd learned that honesty was the only thing that was actually sustainable. "I respect him," Margaret said carefully. "I care about him deeply. Whether that constitutes love in the way you mean it, I'm not entirely sure. But it's real. which is more than I can say for anything in my previous life." Her father turned to look at her. "And if he left tomorrow? If he decided he didn't want you here, what would you do?" "I'd continue doing the work," Margaret said. "The work matters because it's real, not because of who I'm doing it with." Something shifted in her father's expression, a kind of understanding, perhaps reluctant respect. "You've thought about this extensively." "I've lived it," Margaret corrected. "It's not theoretical anymore." Her father returned to his chair and sat heavily, looking older and more tired than before. "I don't approve of this," he said. "I want to be clear about that. But I'm also beginning to understand that my approval is no longer relevant to your decisions." "That's been difficult to accept. I never wanted to hurt you," Margaret said, "but I couldn't continue living a lie to avoid hurting anyone." "No." Her father rubbed his face. "Your mother doesn't agree with me, but I believe you've made the only choice you actually could have made, given your values. That doesn't make the consequences any easier to bear, but it does mean I understand why you made it." He stayed for dinner. Catherine had apparently prepared extra food, anticipating his potential arrival. Thomas was present, and Margaret watched carefully as he and her father interacted. There was no false politeness, no performance. Thomas simply treated her father as another person, neither deferential nor disrespectful, genuinely interested in his observations about the ranch's operations. What struck Margaret was how her father responded to this treatment. Without the performance of social hierarchy to navigate, he seemed more at ease, more genuine. He asked practical questions about ranch management, about Thomas's plans for expansion, about the market for breeding stock. By the end of dinner, her father and Thomas had engaged in a 2-hour conversation about agricultural practices, and Margaret's father seemed almost content, something she'd rarely witnessed in her previous life, where satisfaction seemed dependent on external validation and social standing. Before her father left the next morning, he pulled Margaret aside. "I'm not going to pretend I understand your choices completely," he said, "but I can see that you're living more authentically here than you ever did in our world. That matters, even if I wish the cost hadn't been so high. Will Mother ever forgive me?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Perhaps," her father said. "Though forgiveness might not be the right word. She may eventually come to accept it as an unchangeable reality and move forward from there. But that will take time, and it will require you to be patient with her inability to see things as you do." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt less like approval and more like acceptance of something beyond his control. Then he left, returning to the city and the life Margaret had rejected. After he left, Margaret found herself in a strange emotional state. The visit had confirmed something she'd already understood, that she could not return to her previous life. But it had also suggested that perhaps healing with her family was possible eventually, not now, not soon, but potentially in the future. Thomas found her sitting alone in the barn later that afternoon. "That looked like a difficult conversation," he said, settling himself onto a bale of hay. "It was," Margaret admitted. "He came prepared to convince me to reconsider, to take Harrison back, to resume the life I'd rejected." "Are you reconsidering?" Thomas asked, and Margaret appreciated that he wasn't assuming anything, that he was genuinely asking rather than projecting his own fears. "No," Margaret said, "but it was harder to say that to him than I expected it to be, because part of me will always want his approval. Part of me still believes on some level that his disapproval means I'm making the wrong choice." "That's human," Thomas said. "We're all conditioned to seek approval from the people who raised us. The fact that you're aware of that conditioning and not letting it override your own judgment is what matters." "Does it ever get easier?" Margaret asked. "Choosing yourself over what everyone expects?" "It gets more natural," Thomas said, "but I'm not sure it ever gets easy. It's like the scar from my injury. It doesn't hurt the way it used to, but I'm always aware it's there. I'll probably always feel it when the weather changes, always be reminded that something fundamental altered the course of my life. I just learned to live with it rather than being destroyed by it." Margaret understood what he was saying. The break with her family, the social exile, the rejection of her previous life, these were permanent scars. They wouldn't disappear. But she could learn to live with them, to move forward despite them, to build something real on the foundation of her own choices. Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into the ranch work with renewed purpose. The visit from her father had clarified something she'd been uncertain about, that this wasn't a temporary escape from her real life. This was her real life now. This was the only life she actually wanted. Thomas gradually began including her in more complex decisions about the ranch's future. They discussed expansion plans, breeding programs, modifications to the infrastructure. Margaret contributed ideas, and those ideas were taken seriously, implemented when they proved effective, rejected when they didn't work, all based on merit rather than who suggested them. One afternoon, nearly 3 months after Margaret's arrival, Thomas asked her to walk with him to the northern property boundary. They walked for nearly an hour, discussing the land, the way the soil changed in different sections, the implications for grazing and water management. When they reached a particularly beautiful stretch of land overlooking a small creek, Thomas stopped. "I've been thinking about expanding the ranch," he said. "Building a second house on this section, separate from the main property but still part of the overall operation. Somewhere, someone could live independently but still be part of the ranch ecosystem." Margaret understood what he wasn't quite saying. She waited, letting him find the words. "What I'm asking, without actually asking it properly because I'm not entirely sure how to ask it properly, is whether you'd consider staying here permanently, not as an employee but as—" He paused, searching for language that felt adequate. "As a partner, in the work, in the ranch, in everything. Are you proposing to me?" Margaret asked, a smile playing at her lips. "Badly," Thomas admitted. "I should have done it more formally, probably with some kind of ring and a proper location. But I figured you'd appreciate honesty over performance." "I would," Margaret said. "And yes, yes to staying, yes to partnership, yes to all of it." They stood together looking out at the land, and Margaret understood that this was what real love looked like, not the romantic performance of her engagement to Harrison, but the quiet choice to build something together, to see each other clearly, to commit to the hard work of building a shared life. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Margaret realized she'd found something she'd never known she was looking for. A home that wasn't a place, but a choice, made freely, renewed every single day. The second house began as sketches on Catherine's kitchen table, evolved into detailed plans that Thomas and Margaret refined over weeks of careful consideration, and finally became the first tangible manifestation of their partnership. It was to be built on the northern property, designed to be both independent and integrated with the larger ranch operations, a physical representation of their commitment to building something together while maintaining their individual autonomy. The construction itself became a community affair in a way that Margaret hadn't anticipated. Local ranchers who respected Thomas's work offered their expertise. Skilled craftsmen from the nearby town contributed time and knowledge. What might have been a small private project became a demonstration of how Thomas had earned respect through honest work and fair dealing, respect that extended to Margaret as his partner. Margaret found herself managing the project's logistics, coordinating supplies, ensuring materials arrived when they were needed, maintaining records of expenses and progress. It was administrative work, but it was also deeply purposeful. Every decision she made affected the quality of the final structure. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into construction, a carriage arrived from town. Margaret was overseeing the framing of the kitchen when one of the ranch hands informed her that she had a visitor. Her immediate reaction was anxiety. Visitors from town often brought news that was complicated, reactions to her presence that required navigation. It was Anna Pembroke, a woman Margaret had known peripherally from social circles in her previous life. They'd never been close. Anna moved in slightly less elevated social circles than Margaret's family, but they'd encountered each other frequently at events and gatherings. "I hope I'm not intruding," Anna said carefully, stepping down from the carriage with evident unfamiliarity around ranch environments. She was dressed impeccably in a traveling dress that suggested she'd made a deliberate choice to leave the city. "You're not intruding," Margaret said, though she was curious about what would motivate this visit. "Would you like to see the house?" As Margaret showed Anna around the construction, explaining the layout and design decisions, she found herself describing her life at the ranch in detail. The work, the learning, the genuine satisfaction that came from contributing something tangible. Anna listened without interrupting, asking occasional questions but mostly observing. When they finished the tour, Anna asked to speak with Margaret privately. They sat under the same oak tree where Thomas had explained his vision for the ranch weeks earlier. "I came here because I've been thinking about you," Anna said directly, "and about myself, and about how we were both raised to believe that a certain kind of life was the only acceptable option." Margaret waited, sensing there was more. "I've been unhappy," Anna continued. "Married to a man I respect but don't love, managing a household that doesn't need managing, spending my days maintaining an appearance of contentment that feels increasingly hollow. And watching what you did, rejecting all of that, choosing something real, even though it cost you. Everything, it made me confront some things I've been avoiding." "Are you thinking about leaving?" Margaret asked carefully. "I'm thinking about what leaving would mean," Anna said. "And I'm trying to understand how you managed to be brave enough to do it." "I wasn't brave," Margaret said. "I was desperate. I was suffocating. And desperation gave me the strength to break through. Bravery would be choosing something different when you still have the option to stay comfortable. Desperation is choosing because staying feels like death." Anna considered this. "Does it get easier? The exile, the loss of family, the social judgment?" "The exile becomes normal," Margaret said. "You stop expecting to be included in social circles, so their exclusion stops hurting. But the family part, that's harder. I have hope that eventually my mother might forgive me, that my father has already begun to understand, that time might heal those wounds. But I don't know if it will. That's something I have to accept as a permanent consequence of my choice." They talked for another hour, moving from Margaret's situation to Anna's, discussing the subtle ways that women were taught to make themselves smaller, to desire only what was deemed appropriate, to measure their worth by their utility to others. "I'm not ready to leave," Anna said finally, "but I wanted to understand what it would mean to do so, to know that it's possible, to understand that there are alternatives to the life I'm living." "That's important," Margaret said. "Just knowing the alternative exists changes something inside you. You can't unknow it." After Anna left, promising to stay in touch and hinting at future visits, Margaret found herself reflecting on how dramatically her world had shifted. 6 months ago, she would never have imagined having this kind of conversation with someone from her previous life. Honest, vulnerable, genuinely engaged with difficult questions about autonomy and choice. The construction progressed steadily through the summer. Margaret watched the skeleton of the house become more complete, watched the walls rise, watched the roof take shape. It was deeply satisfying, in a way that nothing in her previous life had been the ability to see tangible progress, to observe how decisions made at the planning stage manifested in physical reality. Thomas worked alongside the construction crew, demonstrating again and again that his missing arm was an absence of a limb, but not an absence of capability. Margaret found herself watching him work sometimes, with a kind of wonderment at how completely he'd integrated his limitation into his life. There was no self-pity, no compensation through other means. There was simply the reality of working within constraints and finding solutions that acknowledged those constraints while refusing to be defeated by them. One evening, as they stood looking at the nearly complete structure, Thomas asked Margaret what she wanted to do about the dote-in. Social aspects of their partnership. What do you mean? Margaret asked. I mean, do you want a formal ceremony? Do you want to be married in the way your previous life defined marriage? He paused. I'm asking because I want to know what matters to you, not what you think should matter. Margaret considered the question seriously. I don't want a performance, she said finally. I don't want an event designed to impress people or demonstrate social status, but I do want something that acknowledges the commitment, something that feels real and intentional. Catherine's been dropping hints that she wants to organize something, Thomas said with a slight smile. She's apparently been planning a small gathering friends from the ranch community, some people from town who actually matter, nothing elaborate. That sounds right, Margaret said. The ceremony took place in early September, on the day the new house was officially completed. It was held in the clearing where they'd walked together months earlier, where Thomas had first asked her to stay. There were perhaps 30 people present, ranch hands, local craftspeople, Anna, who'd returned for the occasion, and Catherine, who cried quietly throughout the ceremony. Margaret wore a dress she'd made herself from practical fabric blue cotton that would hold up to ranch work, simple in design but carefully constructed. Thomas wore clean work clothes, his one arm resting at his side, his expression clear and present rather than performing emotion. The local pastor conducted a brief ceremony that focused not on romantic sentiment, but on the commitment to build something together, to see each other clearly, to honor the work of partnership. When it was over, there was no elaborate reception, just shared food, conversation, and the genuine warmth of people who understood and respected what Margaret and Thomas had chosen. That night, in the new house they'd built together, Margaret stood in the kitchen, a space she designed specifically based on how she worked, and felt something she'd never expected to feel about a home. Deep, uncomplicated contentment. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked, coming to stand beside her. "I'm satisfied," Margaret corrected, which is different from happy. Happy suggests an absence of difficulty. Satisfied suggests that the work is worthwhile despite difficulty. "Is it?" Thomas asked. "Worthwhile?" "Completely," Margaret said. Over the following weeks, Margaret established a new rhythm to her life. She divided her time between the original ranch house, where Catherine still lived and where much of the administrative work occurred, and the new house, which became the center of her partnership with Thomas. She continued working with the horses, managing the ranch's business affairs, and contributing to the planning of the next phase of expansion. What surprised her was how her skills from her previous life began to manifest in new contexts. Her knowledge of social hierarchy, which had once been used to navigate ballrooms and dinner parties, became useful for understanding how to build relationships with suppliers and business partners. Her eye for aesthetics, which had been applied to decorative matters, became valuable for understanding how space could be organized for both function and beauty. She discovered that she hadn't needed to reject everything about her previous life. She'd needed to reject only the performance, the falseness, the requirement to diminish herself. The actual skills and knowledge remained useful. They simply needed to be applied in service of something real rather than something decorative. One afternoon in October, a letter arrived from her mother. It was the first communication Margaret had received from her in the 6 months since breaking the engagement. Margaret held it for a long time before opening it, steeling herself for judgment or manipulation or withdrawal of love contingent on recanting her choices. The letter was shorter than she expected and far more honest than she dared hope. "Margaret, your father has spoken extensively about his visit to the ranch and about you. I have resisted his suggestions that I reconsider my position toward you, but recent events have forced me to confront some truths about my own life that I've been avoiding. I will not pretend to approve of your choices. They remain foreign to my understanding of how a woman should live. However, I have begun to suspect that my disapproval says more about my own limitations than about the actual wisdom or foolishness of your decisions. I am not ready to forgive or to celebrate what you've done, but I would like to understand it better. If you are willing, I would like to visit the ranch and see for myself how you are living." Mother Margaret read the letter 3 times, trying to assess what her mother was actually offering and what she was still withholding. It wasn't reconciliation, it wasn't approval, but it was something that resembled an opening. A crack in the edifice of judgment that had been constructed around Margaret's choices. She showed the letter to Thomas. "What do you want to do?" he asked, handing it back to her. "I want her to come," Margaret said. "But I'm nervous. I don't know how she'll react to the reality of this life. I don't know if she'll see it as authentic or as delusion." "Then invite her and let her experience it," Thomas said. "You can't control her reaction. You can only be honest about your choices and hope that honesty eventually speaks louder than judgment." Margaret wrote back to her mother, extending an invitation for a visit. She described the ranch in detail, explained what her life looked like now, and asked her mother to come with an open mind if she was willing. The response came 2 weeks later. Her mother would arrive in November. As Margaret prepared for this visit, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed in 6 months. She'd gone from desperate exile to genuine home. She'd transformed from a woman performing someone else's life to a woman living her own. She'd learned that authenticity wasn't just about rejecting the false, it was about actively building something real in its place. The foundation had been laid. Now came the work of continuing to build on it, of weathering whatever challenges came next, of proving through daily choices that the sacrifice had been worth the cost. Margaret stood at the window of the new house, watching the autumn landscape shift colors as November approached. Leaves were turning gold and crimson, trees beginning their seasonal transformation, the world preparing for dormancy and eventual renewal. Her mother would arrive in 3 days, and Margaret found herself moving between anticipation and dread with unsettling regularity. She'd written to her mother carefully, describing the ranch without embellishment, explaining her work, her partnership with Thomas, her life. But words on the paper couldn't convey the reality of what she'd built here, the physical evidence of choosing differently, the proof written into the structure of her days. Thomas found her at the window and wrapped his remaining arm around her shoulders. He'd learned to make the gesture work, had adapted his embrace to acknowledge his physical reality without requiring anything from her but presence. "You're worried she'll try to convince you to come back," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "I'm worried she'll see all of this and judge it as inadequate," Margaret admitted. "I'm worried she'll look at you and see only what you've lost rather than what you've built. I'm worried that no matter how I explain my choices, she'll never understand them as anything other than failure." "Some of those fears might be justified," Thomas said gently. "She might judge, she might not understand. But Margaret, you've already proven that you can live authentically regardless of whether anyone else validates it. Your mother's potential disapproval isn't actually a threat anymore, it's just background noise to your actual life." He was right, though acknowledging it was harder than accepting the logic. Margaret had spent her entire first 28 years seeking her mother's approval, structuring her choices around gaining it, internalizing her mother's values as though they were her own. Breaking that pattern was a daily practice, not a single decision made and finished with. The carriage arrived on a grey November afternoon, bringing Margaret's mother to the Hartwick Ranch. Eleanor Hartwell descended with the careful movements of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain, her face showing the strain of travel and the visible effort of maintaining composure in a situation she clearly found uncomfortable. Catherine had prepared the guest room in the main house neutral territory that wasn't Margaret's personal space, but also wasn't entirely removed from the ranch operation. The strategy was subtle but deliberate. Margaret's mother would be present enough to understand the reality of this life, but not so immersed that she'd feel her entire value system was under attack. The first evening was awkward in the way that most first meetings between people with conflicting worldviews tend to be. Dinner conversation moved carefully around topics, touching on weather and travel and the condition of the property without addressing anything that mattered. Margaret's mother asked polite questions about the ranch, but with the tone of someone asking about a curiosity rather than something of genuine interest. It wasn't until the second morning that the real conversation began. Margaret found her mother in the kitchen with Catherine, both of them seated with coffee, and something in the composition of the scene suggested that her mother had deliberately sought out time with Catherine. Whether to interrogate her or to have honest conversation, Margaret wasn't immediately certain. "I was just telling your mother about the building of the new house," Catherine said easily. "About how Margaret managed the logistics and design elements. She has a real talent for understanding spatial organization and workflow efficiency." "That's surprising," Eleanor said, and Margaret detected the note of genuine confusion in her mother's voice. Margaret was never particularly interested in practical matters. She was trained in aesthetics and social management. Perhaps she was never given the opportunity to discover her actual interests, Catherine said, with the kind of gentle precision that suggested she'd been planning this conversation. "It's difficult to know what you actually want when you've been conditioned to want only what you're supposed to want." Eleanor looked at Margaret. "Is that what happened to you? You suddenly discovered hidden talents you didn't know you possessed?" "Not hidden," Margaret said carefully. "More like permitted. When you're not required to perform a specific role, you discover what you actually enjoy doing, what you're actually capable of." "And you enjoy ranch management?" Eleanor asked, and Margaret detected the skepticism in her voice. "I enjoy meaningful work," Margaret corrected. "Work that has immediate, tangible consequences. Work where I can see the direct results of my decisions, rather than work that exists primarily to maintain an appearance." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "Your father told me that you've been happy here. He used that specific word. In 40 years of marriage, I've rarely heard him describe anyone as genuinely happy. But he said that about you." "I'm not sure I'd describe myself as happy," Margaret said honestly. "Satisfied, perhaps. Content. At peace. But happiness suggests an absence of difficulty, and my life here isn't without difficulty. It's just that the difficulties feel purposeful rather than existential." "That's remarkably articulate," Eleanor observed, "and remarkably different from anything you would have said 6 months ago." "Because 6 months ago, I didn't have language for what I was actually experiencing," Margaret said. "I had language for performance, for conformity, for navigating social structures, but I didn't have language for authenticity because no one had modeled it for me." There was a silence in which Margaret could almost hear her mother processing this indictment. Eleanor had raised her daughter to be decorative, compliant, valuable primarily for her ability to reflect well on her family's status. The fact that Margaret was suggesting this had been limiting, that there might have been value in a different kind of training, was clearly challenging Eleanor's understanding of how she'd spent her maternal energy. "I did what I thought was best," Eleanor said finally, and Margaret heard the defensiveness beneath the words. "I know," Margaret said. "You were doing what you'd been trained to do, just as I was doing what you trained me to do. The difference is that I've chosen to break the cycle. I've chosen to learn a different way of being in the world." Eleanor stood abruptly and moved to the window, looking out at the ranch. "Show me," she said. "Show me what you actually do here. Don't explain it or justify it. Just show me what your days look like." So Margaret did. She took her mother to the barns and showed her the horses, explaining the breeding program and the training methods. She showed her the administrative work, the records, the correspondence, the careful management of resources. She introduced her to the ranch hands, and Eleanor observed how they treated Margaret not with the deference due to a wealthy woman, but with the respect due to a competent colleague. They spent the afternoon working on repairs to a section of fencing practical work that required physical labor and problem-solving. Eleanor found herself doing actual work alongside Margaret, her carefully maintained hands becoming dirty, her expensive dress getting dusty. Somewhere around the third fence section, something shifted. She stopped performing the role of observer and simply began participating. By evening, Eleanor was exhausted in a way Margaret suspected she'd never been exhausted before, the honest exhaustion of physical labor rather than the performative exhaustion of social obligations. During dinner, Eleanor asked Thomas direct questions about his work, about his plans for the ranch, about how he managed his operation with a single arm. What struck Margaret was that her mother asked these questions without a note of pity, without the undertone of concern for his tragic circumstance. She asked them the way anyone would ask about someone's work, with genuine interest in the practical and strategic elements. After dinner, Eleanor asked to speak with Margaret alone. They sat in the parlor of the main house, and Eleanor was quiet for a long time before speaking. "I came here prepared to convince you to reconsider," Eleanor said. "I had a whole conversation prepared, arguments I was going to make about security and status and the importance of maintaining family connections. I was going to suggest that perhaps you'd made a hasty decision while upset and that it wasn't too late to correct course." "Why didn't you?" Margaret asked. "Because I watched you work today," Eleanor said, "and I saw something I've never seen in you before. I saw you being fully present in what you were doing. I saw you being valued for what you contributed, not for how you looked or who your family was. I saw you being actual." She paused, and Margaret saw her mother's eyes grow wet. "I realized watching you that I've never felt that way," Eleanor continued. "I've spent my entire adult life performing a role, maintaining an appearance, ensuring that I reflected well on my family's status. And I believed that was what being a woman meant, that it was the best I could hope for. But watching you today, I understood that there might be something more. Something that requires giving up security, certainly. Something that requires accepting judgment and exile. But something that's actually real." Margaret felt her own eyes burn with tears. This was not reconciliation exactly. Her mother was not apologizing for how she'd raised her, was not validating every choice Margaret had made. But it was something deeper. It was her mother recognizing that the life she'd chosen, that she'd trained her daughter to want, might not be the only valuable way to exist. "I'm not going to change completely," Eleanor said. "I'm too old, and I'm too invested in my own life. But I think I understand now why you made the choice you did, and I think I can at least respect it, even if I don't fully approve." Over the remaining days of her visit, Eleanor continued working alongside Margaret, learning the practical aspects of ranch life, watching how decisions were made, how problems were solved. She spent time with Thomas and found, to her apparent surprise, that he was intelligent, capable, and genuinely interested in understanding her perspective rather than defending against her judgment. On her last evening, Eleanor asked Margaret a direct question. "Do you regret breaking the engagement? Do you regret rejecting the life you were supposed to have?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain it caused my family," she said finally. "I regret that my father's financial situation became more precarious. I regret that my mother spent months believing I'd made an irrevocable mistake. But do I regret the actual choice? No. I regret nothing about choosing authenticity, even though the cost has been significant." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Your father will likely come around more completely than I will. He's always been more practical, more willing to let people chart their own courses. I'm more rigid, I suppose. But I want you to know that I'm trying to understand. That matters, doesn't it? It matters more than you know," Margaret said. Eleanor returned to the city the next morning. Before she left, she embraced Margaret with genuine warmth, rather than the performative embrace of her arrival. She shook Thomas's hand with respect. She thanked Catherine for her hospitality, and as the carriage pulled away, Margaret felt something settle inside her, not closure exactly, but a kind of peace. The relationship with her mother would never be what it might have been if she'd followed the prescribed path. There would likely always be a certain distance, a fundamental difference in values and worldview. But her mother had come to the ranch prepared to judge and had instead chosen understanding. That was its own form of love. That night, Margaret stood with Thomas in their new house, looking out at the ranch that had become their shared project and their shared life. "Your mother might visit again," Thomas observed. "I think she might," Margaret said. "I think she might even start to understand this place over time. Not necessarily approve of it, but understand it." "That's more than you could have hoped for 6 months ago," Thomas said. "It is," Margaret agreed. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear November sky. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been performing happiness, conforming to expectations, gradually disappearing into the role she'd been assigned. She thought about the choice point, the moment when she'd stepped forward in a church hall and agreed to marry a stranger because it was better than the alternative. She thought about how that desperation had led her to honesty, and how honesty had led her to this. It wasn't the life anyone would have predicted for her. It wasn't the life that had been planned, the life that was supposed to guarantee security and happiness through the careful performance of appropriate behavior. But it was real. It was earned. It was hers. And that, Margaret had learned, was worth everything she'd sacrificed to obtain it. The expanded ranch operation was thriving. Thomas's breeding program had attracted attention from ranchers across several states. Margaret's administrative and design innovations had streamlined operations and increased efficiency. Catherine had begun mentoring younger women interested in learning ranch management. Margaret's father visited quarterly, bringing business associates who wanted to understand the innovative agricultural practices being implemented. Her mother had visited 3 times, and on her most recent visit had actually participated in fence mending without being asked, a gesture that meant more to Margaret than any words could convey. Anna Pembroke had divorced her husband and now spent half the year managing a small educational project on the ranch, teaching other women that alternatives to the prescribed life actually existed. Most importantly, Margaret had stopped waiting for external validation. She'd learned that the quiet satisfaction of honest work, the genuine connection of partnership with someone who saw her completely, and the knowledge that she was building something real rather than performing something false. These were the only validations that actually mattered. She was no longer the woman who'd been rejected by society. She was the woman who'd rejected society in favor of something infinitely more valuable: herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.